What if everything you thought you knew about Ilhan Omar was wrong? What if, behind the headlines, the sound bites, and the relentless criticism, there was a story so powerful, so deeply human, that it could silence even her harshest critics? Today, you're about to witness a moment that will challenge your assumptions, stir your emotions, and remind you why real stories matter more than political theater. Because sometimes the loudest voices in the room are the ones who have never truly listened, and sometimes the person you think you know best is the one you've never really heard at all. It was supposed to be just another congressional hearing. The kind of day where politicians trade barbs, cameras flash, and the news cycle churns out another round of outrage. But on this day, something extraordinary happened. The room was packed, the tension was thick, and the stakes were higher than anyone realized. At the center of it all stood Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, a figure who has become a lightning rod for controversy, a target for attacks from both sides of the aisle, and a symbol of something much bigger than herself. As the hearing began, the usual suspects took their seats. The critics, the skeptics, the pundits ready to pounce on every word. They had their talking points, their rehearsed lines, their carefully crafted narratives. But what they didn't have was her story. Not the real one, not the one that began long before she ever set foot in the halls of Congress. Not the one forged in the fires of war, displacement, and unimaginable loss. The chairman called the session to order, his gavel echoing through the chamber. The topic was immigration reform, a subject that has divided the nation, fueled countless debates, and shaped the lives of millions. For Ilhan Omar, it was more than policy. It was personal. It was the story of her life. As the first speakers delivered their statements, the atmosphere grew charged. Some spoke of border security, others of economic impact. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of something deeper, a battle over who gets to define what it means to be American. And as Ilhan Omar prepared to speak, you could feel the room shift. Eyes narrowed, pens poised, cameras zoomed in, hungry for a soundbite, a misstep, a moment to exploit. But what happened next was not what anyone expected. Instead of launching into statistics or policy proposals, Ilhan Omar paused. She looked around the room, her gaze steady, her voice calm but resolute. And then, with a quiet intensity that demanded attention, she began to tell her story. "You don't know my story," she said, her words cutting through the noise like a blade. "You think you do. You think you know who I am, what I believe, why I fight. But you don't. Not really." The room fell silent. For a moment, even her most vocal critics seemed caught off guard. This wasn't the Ilhan Omar they were used to, the one they'd seen on cable news, the one they'd read about in op-eds and social media threads. This was something different, something raw, something real. She spoke of her childhood in Somalia, a place of beauty and heartbreak, of family and fear. She described the day her world changed forever, the day war came to her doorstep, the day she became a refugee. She spoke of the camps, the hunger, the uncertainty, of nights spent listening to her mother's whispered prayers, of days spent searching for hope in a world that seemed determined to snuff it out. As she spoke, the room seemed to shrink. The usual posturing faded away, replaced by something rare in Washington, genuine attention. Even those who had come to challenge her, to undermine her, found themselves drawn in by the force of her story. She spoke of arriving in America, a land she had only dreamed of, a place that promised safety but demanded resilience. She spoke of learning a new language, navigating a new culture, and facing a new kind of scrutiny. She spoke of the moments when she felt invisible, when her hijab marked her as different, when her accent made her a target. But she also spoke of the kindness of strangers, the teachers who believed in her, the neighbors who welcomed her family with open arms. "You see me now," she said, her voice steady, "but you don't see the journey that brought me here. You don't see the sacrifices my family made, the nights my mother spent awake, worrying about our future. You don't see the fear, the hope, the the determination that carried us across continents and oceans. The critics shifted in their seats, some glancing down, others looking away. The power of her words was undeniable. This was not a speech crafted for applause or headlines. This was a testimony, a reminder that behind every policy debate, every political battle, there are real people with real stories. And then, just as the room began to settle, she delivered the line that would echo far beyond the walls of that hearing room. I am not here because I am lucky. I am here because I am resilient, because my family refused to give up, because America, at its best, is a place where even the most unlikely stories can become possible. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the weight of her words, the truth of her experience, the undeniable humanity that connected her to everyone in that room, whether they wanted to admit it or not. But this was only the beginning. Because as Ilhan Omar continued, she would not only share her story, she would challenge her critics to confront their own assumptions, to see beyond the headlines, to recognize the power of empathy in a world too often divided by fear. If you think you know Ilhan Omar, think again. Because the story you're about to hear is not just hers, it's a story that belongs to all of us. And by the end of this video, you may find yourself questioning not just what you believe about her, but what you believe about America itself. As the echoes of Ilhan Omar's opening words lingered in the air, the hearing room seemed to hold its breath. The usual rhythm of political sparring was broken, replaced by a rare and fragile silence. Even the most seasoned observers, journalists who had covered 1,000 hearings, staffers who had seen every trick in the book, could sense that something different was unfolding. This was not just another speech. This was a reckoning, Ilhan Omar's. Critics had come prepared with their questions, their accusations, their carefully rehearsed lines. They were ready to challenge her on policy, to question her loyalty, to paint her as an outsider. But as she continued, it became clear that she was not playing by their rules. She was not there to defend herself against caricatures or to fit neatly into the boxes they had built for her. She was there to tell the truth, the kind of truth that cannot be spun or sanitized. She spoke of the journey from Somalia to America, a journey marked by loss and longing, by hope and heartbreak. She described the refugee camp in Kenya where she spent her formative years, a place where dreams were fragile and survival was never guaranteed. She spoke of the friends she lost, the family members left behind, the moments when despair threatened to swallow her whole. But she also spoke of resilience, the quiet, stubborn determination that kept her moving forward, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Every day in that camp, she said, I learned what it means to fight for your future. I learned that hope is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It is the thing that keeps you alive when everything else is gone. Her words were not just a recounting of facts. They were an invitation to see the world through her eyes, to understand the forces that had shaped her, to recognize the humanity that connects us all. She spoke of the first time she saw an American flag fluttering above the camp, a symbol of possibility in a world of uncertainty. She spoke of the day her family received the news that they would be resettled in the United States, a day of joy and fear, of gratitude and anxiety. For so many, America is a dream, she said. But for refugees, it is also a test of whether that dream is real, whether it is big enough to include people like me. As she spoke, the camera panned across the room, capturing the faces of her colleagues, her critics, her supporters. Some looked moved, others skeptical, but all were listening. The power of her story was undeniable. It was a reminder that behind every political debate, there are real lives at stake, lives shaped by forces beyond their control, lives defined by courage and sacrifice. But Ilhan Omar was not content to simply share her own story. She turned her attention to the broader debate, challenging her colleagues to look beyond the headlines and the talking points. She spoke of the millions of refugees around the world, people who had been forced to flee their homes, their countries, their lives. She spoke of the children growing up in camps, the parents making impossible choices, the families torn apart by war and violence. Every time we debate immigration, she said, we are debating the fate of people like me. People who have lost everything, but who still believe in the promise of a better life. People who are willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Her words were a challenge, a call to empathy, to understanding, to action. She reminded her colleagues that America's strength has always come from its ability to welcome the stranger, to offer hope to the hopeless, to build a nation out of diversity and difference. But even as she spoke, the critics were waiting. They had their questions, their doubts, their suspicions. And as the chairman opened the floor for questions, the first critic wasted no time. Congresswoman Omar, he began, his tone sharp. You speak of your experiences, but how can we be sure that your story is not just a convenient narrative? How do we know that you are not using your past to deflect from the real issues at hand? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. It was a challenge not just to her story, but to her very identity. For a moment, the room tensed, waiting to see how she would respond. Ilhan Omar did not flinch. She met her critic's gaze, her voice unwavering. You ask how you can be sure my story is real. I ask you, how can you be sure it is not? How can you look at me, at my family, at the millions of refugees around the world, and assume that our pain is a performance, that our hope is a lie? Her words were not angry, but they were firm. She refused to be diminished, to be reduced to a stereotype or a soundbite. She spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through the worst and emerged stronger. My story is not a shield, she said. It is a window into a world that too many people would rather ignore. A world where children go to bed hungry, where families are torn apart, where hope is a dangerous thing. I share my story not to deflect, but to connect, to remind you that behind every policy, every law, every debate, there are real people whose lives hang in the balance. The room was silent once more. Even her critics seemed momentarily disarmed, caught off guard by the force of her conviction. But Ilhan Omar was not finished. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, drawing the audience in. If you truly want to understand the issues we face, you must first be willing to listen. Not just to me, but to the millions of voices that have been silenced, ignored, forgotten. You must be willing to see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. With those words, she shifted the conversation, turning a moment of confrontation into an opportunity for reflection. The hearing was no longer just about policy. It was about empathy, about understanding, about the power of story to bridge even the deepest divides. The hearing room, once a battleground of rehearsed arguments and partisan sound bites, now felt transformed. Ilhan Omar's words had not only shifted the mood, but had also forced a reckoning, a pause in the relentless churn of political theater. For a brief moment, the usual lines of division blurred, replaced by a shared sense of humanity. But as the silence lingered, the tension began to rebuild. The critics, though momentarily disarmed, were not ready to surrender. They regrouped, searching for new angles, new ways to challenge her narrative. A second critic, a congresswoman known for her tough questioning, leaned forward. Her voice was measured, but her intent was clear. Congresswoman Omar, you speak eloquently about your past, but what about now? How do you respond to those who say your story is being used to push an agenda that doesn't reflect American values? The question was sharp, designed to put Ilhan Omar on the defensive. But she did not retreat. Instead, she welcomed the challenge, using it as an opportunity to deepen the conversation. I am often told that my story is not American enough, she began, her tone calm but resolute. But what does it mean to be American? Is it a matter of where you were born? Or is it about the values you hold, the dreams you pursue, the courage you show in the face of adversity? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. My story is not unique. It is the story of millions who have come to this country seeking a better life. It is the story of those who have faced hardship, who have overcome obstacles, who have contributed to the fabric of this nation in ways both big and small. Her words resonated not just with her supporters, but with anyone who had ever felt like an outsider, anyone who had ever struggled to find their place. She spoke of the teachers who had encouraged her, the neighbors who had welcomed her, family, the community that had helped them rebuild their lives. She spoke of the challenges they faced: racism, xenophobia, the constant pressure to prove their worth, but also of the triumphs, the moments of connection, the small victories that made all the difference. Being American is not about erasing your past, she said. It is about bringing your whole self to the table. It is about honoring your roots while reaching for something greater. It is about believing that no matter where you come from, you have a right to belong. The room was quiet, the weight of her words settling over the assembled lawmakers and spectators. But the critics were not finished. Another congressman, his voice tinged with skepticism, pressed her further. Congresswoman, some say your views are too radical, that you don't represent the mainstream. How do you respond to those who question your loyalty to this country? The accusation was familiar, one she had faced countless times before. But instead of bristling, Ilhan Omar leaned into the moment, her response both measured and powerful. Loyalty is not blind obedience, she said. Loyalty is the willingness to speak out when you see injustice, to challenge the status quo, to fight for a country that lives up to its highest ideals. My love for this country is not diminished by my criticism, it is strengthened by it, because I believe that America can be better, that we must always strive to be better. She spoke of her oath of office, the promise she made to uphold the Constitution, to serve her constituents, to fight for justice and equality. She spoke of the sacrifices her family had made, the risks they had taken, the faith they had placed in the American dream. My loyalty is to the people I represent, she said, to the children who look like me, who wonder if they have a place in this country, to the families who struggle to make ends meet, who dream of a better future, to the ideals that make America worth fighting for: freedom, justice, opportunity for all. Her words were a reminder that patriotism is not about conformity, but about courage. It is about holding your country accountable, about demanding that it live up to its promises, about believing that change is possible. As she spoke, the mood in the room shifted once again. The critics, though still skeptical, seemed to recognize the sincerity of her conviction. The supporters, emboldened by her words, nodded in agreement, and those in the middle, the undecided, the uncertain, found themselves drawn in by the force of her story. But Ilhan Omar was not finished. She turned her attention to the broader audience, to those watching at home, to the millions who had followed her journey from afar. I know that my presence here makes some people uncomfortable, she said. I know that my story challenges the narratives we tell ourselves about who belongs, about what it means to be American. But I am here to tell you that our strength lies in our diversity, in our ability to learn from one another, to grow together, to build a future that is big enough for all of us. She spoke of the power of empathy, of the need to listen to voices that have been marginalized, of the importance of building bridges instead of walls. She spoke of her hopes for the future, a future where every child, regardless of where they come from, can dream without fear, can strive without limits, can belong without question. As she finished, the room erupted in applause, not just from her supporters, but from those who had been moved by the power of her words, the depth of her conviction, the courage of her story. But the story was not over, because, as the hearing continued, new challenges would arise, new critics would emerge, and Ilhan Omar would be called upon once again to defend not just her story, but the very idea of what it means to be American. If you think you've heard it all, think again, because the most powerful moments are still to come. Stay with us, because what happens next will change the way you see not just Ilhan Omar, but the country we all call home. The applause faded, but the impact of Ilhan Omar's words lingered like a quiet storm. Even as the hearing pressed on, the energy in the room had shifted. Some critics, still determined to challenge her, exchanged glances and shuffled their notes, searching for a new line of attack. Others, perhaps for the first time, seemed to be wrestling with the uncomfortable truth that the story they thought they knew was far more complex and far more human than they had ever imagined. But Ilhan Omar was not naive. She knew that a single speech, no matter how powerful, would not erase years of suspicion, nor would it silence every critic. She understood that her very presence in Congress was a challenge to the status quo, a living contradiction to the narratives that had long dominated American politics. And she was ready for what came next. A senior congressman, respected for his experience but known for his hardline views, leaned forward. His voice was calm, but his words were pointed. Congresswoman Omar, you speak of unity and belonging, but many Americans feel divided. They worry that our differences are tearing us apart. How do you respond to those who say that your story, and stories like yours, are part of the problem? The question was a familiar one, echoing the anxieties that ripple through the country in times of change. But Ilhan Omar met it head-on, her response both honest and hopeful. I understand those fears, she said. Change is never easy. It can be unsettling to see new faces, to hear new voices, to confront new ideas. But I believe that our differences are not a threat. They are our greatest strength. America has always been a nation of immigrants, a place where people from every corner of the world come together to build something greater than themselves. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. Division is not caused by diversity. Division is caused by fear, fear of the unknown, fear of losing what we have, fear of being left behind. But the answer to fear is not exclusion. It is understanding. It is empathy. It is the willingness to see each other not as strangers, but as fellow travelers on the same journey. Her words resonated, not just as rhetoric, but as a lived truth. She spoke of her own journey, of the moments when she had felt alone, when she had wondered if she would ever truly belong. She spoke of the kindness of strangers, the generosity of neighbors, the small acts of courage that had helped her family find their place in a new land. Every time someone reached out a hand, every time someone offered a smile, every time someone chose to listen instead of judge, they helped build a bridge. And those bridges are what make America strong. The congressman nodded, perhaps not convinced, but at least willing to listen. The hearing moved on, but the conversation had changed. The focus shifted from confrontation to connection, from accusation to understanding. But outside the hearing room, the world was still watching. News outlets picked up the story, social media buzzed with reactions, and the hashtag #YouDon'tKnowMyStory began to trend. People from all walks of life, immigrants, refugees, lifelong Americans, shared their own stories, their own struggles, their own hopes for a country that could live up to its ideals. Ilhan Omar's speech had become more than a moment. It had become a movement. But with that movement came new challenges. The critics grew louder, their attacks more personal. They questioned her motives, her loyalty, her very right to serve. They dredged up old controversies, twisted her words, tried to paint her as an outsider, an enemy, a threat. Ilhan Omar faced it all with the same resilience that had carried her from a refugee camp in Kenya to the halls of Congress. She refused to be defined by her critics. She refused to let their fear dictate her future. In interviews and town halls, she continued to share her story, not as a shield, but as a bridge. She listened to the concerns of her constituents, even those who disagreed with her. She visited schools and community centers, sat with families struggling to make ends meet, listened to veterans, teachers, small business owners. She made it clear that her story was not just about her, it was about all of them. Every one of us has a story, she said at a community forum. Every one of us has faced challenges, overcome obstacles, dreamed of something better. My story is just one thread in the fabric of America. Together our stories make us stronger. Her words inspired some, challenged others, but always invited reflection. She encouraged people to look beyond the headlines, to see the humanity in those they might otherwise dismiss. She reminded them that empathy is not weakness, but strength, that the courage to listen is just as important as the courage to speak. As the weeks passed, the impact of her speech continued to ripple outward. Young people, especially those from immigrant and refugee backgrounds, wrote letters and emails, thanking her for giving voice to their experiences. Teachers used her story in classrooms, sparking conversations about identity, belonging, and the meaning of citizenship. Community leaders reached out, seeking ways to build bridges across divides. But the critics did not disappear. Some doubled down, insisting that her story was a distraction, that her presence was a provocation. They launched new attacks, spread new rumors, tried to drown out her message with noise and outrage. Ilhan Omar met each challenge with grace and determination. She refused to be silenced. She refused to let fear win. And as the next hearing approached, the stakes grew even higher. The nation was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Would her critics finally succeed in breaking her spirit? Or would her story, and the stories of millions like hers, continue to shape the future of America? If you think you know how this story ends, think again, because the most powerful moments are still ahead. Stay with us, because what happens next will not only test Ilhan Omar's resolve, it will test the very soul of our democracy. The day of the next hearing arrived with a sense of anticipation that was impossible to ignore. The corridors of Congress buzzed with speculation, reporters clustered outside committee rooms, and social media feeds filled with predictions and hot takes. For Ilhan Omar, the pressure was immense. She knew that every word, every gesture, every pause would be scrutinized, dissected, and spun. But she also knew that this was her moment, not just to defend herself, but to speak for all those whose stories had been overlooked, dismissed, or distorted. As she entered the hearing room, the atmosphere was electric. Supporters offered quiet nods of encouragement, while critics eyed her with a mix of skepticism and resolve. The chairman called the session to order, and the proceedings began. The topic was national security, a subject that had often been used to question her loyalty, her judgment, even her right to serve. The stakes could not have been higher. The first round of questions came quickly, each one sharper than the last. A congressman from a neighboring state, known for his tough stance on immigration, wasted no time. Congresswoman Omar, given your background, how can the American people trust that your decisions are made in the best interest of our country? The question was designed to put her on the defensive, to force her into a corner. But Ilhan Omar did not flinch. She met the congressman's gaze, her voice steady and clear. "I understand your concerns," she began. "But let me be clear. My loyalty is to the Constitution, to the people I represent, and to the ideals that make this country great. My background does not make me less American. It makes me more committed to the promise of America. Because I know what it means to fight for freedom, to cherish democracy, to believe in the possibility of a better future." She spoke of her oath of office, the solemn promise she had made to uphold the laws of the land, to serve with integrity, to put the needs of her constituents above all else. She reminded the committee that her story was not unique, that America had always been shaped by people from every corner of the globe, people who brought with them new ideas, new perspectives, new energy. National security is not just about borders and walls, she said. It is about building a society where everyone has a stake in our future, where everyone feels safe, valued, and heard. It is about protecting the rights and freedoms that define us as a nation. Her words were met with a mix of reactions, some nods of agreement, some skeptical frowns, some thoughtful silences. But the hearing was far from over. A second critic, a senator with a reputation for fiery rhetoric, leaned forward. "Congresswoman, you talk about unity and inclusion, but what about the threats we face from abroad? How can we be sure that your background doesn't cloud your judgment when it comes to protecting American interests?" The implication was clear, and the room tensed. But Ilhan Omar responded with the same calm resolve that had become her trademark. "My background gives me a unique perspective," she said. "I have seen firsthand the consequences of war, the devastation of conflict, the pain of displacement. I know what it means to lose everything, to start over, to build a new life from nothing. That experience does not cloud my judgment, it sharpens it. It reminds me of what is at stake, of the human cost of our decisions, of the need to pursue peace and security not just for some, but for all." She spoke of the importance of diplomacy, of building alliances, of working with partners around the world to address the root causes of conflict. She spoke of the need for compassion as well as strength, for wisdom as well as resolve. "True security is not built on fear," she said. "It is built on trust, on cooperation, on the belief that our greatest strength lies in our ability to come together, to solve problems, to build a future that is safer, more just, more hopeful for everyone. The senator, momentarily disarmed, leaned back in his chair. The room was quiet, the tension palpable. But Ilhan Omar was not finished. She turned to the audience, to the millions watching at home, to the young people who saw themselves in her story. I know what it's like, to be doubted, to be questioned, to be told that you don't belong. But I also know that the only way to change hearts and minds is to keep showing up, to keep telling the truth, to keep fighting for a country that lives up to its highest ideals. Her words were a rallying cry, a call to action for anyone who had ever felt like an outsider, anyone who had ever been told that their story didn't matter. She reminded them that their voices were powerful, that their experiences were valid, that their dreams were worth fighting for. As the hearing drew to a close, the chairman offered a final question. Congresswoman Omar, what do you hope people take away from your story? She paused, her eyes scanning the room, her voice soft but unwavering. I hope they see that America is not defined by fear, but by hope. That our strength comes not from shutting people out, but from welcoming them in. That every story matters, and that together we can build a future that is big enough for all of us. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. And as the cameras clicked, as the headlines began to form, it was clear that something had changed, not just for Ilhan Omar, but for the country she served. But the journey was not over. The challenges would continue, the critics would persist, and the fight for a more just and inclusive America would go on. And through it all, Ilhan Omar's story would remain a beacon of hope, a testament to resilience, a reminder that the most powerful voices are often the ones we least expect. If you think this is the end, think again. Because the story of Ilhan Omar and the story of America is still being written. Stay with us, because the next chapter is just beginning. As the hearing adjourned and the crowd slowly filtered out, the echoes of Ilhan Omar's words lingered in the marble halls of Congress. Reporters rushed to file their stories, pundits prepared their takes, and social media erupted with debate. But for those who had truly listened, something deeper had shifted. The story that had unfolded was not just about one congresswoman or one hearing. It was about the power of truth, the courage to be vulnerable, and the resilience it takes to stand tall in the face of relentless scrutiny. Outside the hearing room, Ilhan Omar was greeted by a small group of supporters, young people, immigrants, mothers with children in tow. They thanked her for her honesty, for her strength, for daring to speak a truth that so many had been waiting to hear. She listened to their stories, offered words of encouragement, and reminded them that their voices mattered just as much as hers. But even as she stepped into the sunlight, the critics did not relent. Headlines questioned her motives, commentators dissected her every word, and opponents doubled down on their attacks. Yet, for every voice raised in anger or suspicion, there were others who found hope in her story, who saw in her journey a reflection of their own struggles, their own dreams, their own belief in the promise of America. In the days that followed, the impact of her speech continued to ripple outward. Teachers played clips of her testimony in classrooms, sparking conversations about empathy, identity, and the meaning of citizenship. Community leaders organized forums to discuss the challenges faced by immigrants and refugees, using her words as a starting point for dialogue and understanding. Families gathered around dinner tables, sharing their own stories of resilience and hope. Ilhan Omar's message was clear: you don't know my story. But by sharing it, she invited others to share theirs. She reminded the nation that every person, no matter where they come from, what language they speak, or what faith they practice, has a story worth hearing. She challenged her critics not just to listen, but to understand. Not just to tolerate, but to embrace. Not just to debate, but to connect. And as the days turned into weeks, something remarkable began to happen. The hashtag, "You Don't Know My Story," became a rallying cry for people across the country. Veterans shared memories of their own journeys. Teachers posted about students who had overcome incredible odds. Parents wrote about the sacrifices they had made for their children. The movement grew, fueled not by anger or division, but by a shared belief in the power of empathy and the importance of every voice. For Ilhan Omar, the journey was far from over. The challenges would continue, the critics would persist, and the work of building a more just and inclusive America would demand everything she had to give. But she faced the future with the same resilience that had carried her from a refugee camp in Kenya to the halls of Congress. She knew that her story was not just her own. It was the story of millions who had dared to hope, to dream, to believe in something greater than themselves. And so, as the sun set on another day in Washington, Ilhan Omar stood tall, not just as a congresswoman, but as a symbol of what is possible. When we refuse to be defined by fear, when we choose courage over comfort, when we dare to tell our stories, even when the world is not ready to hear them. If you've made it this far, you know that this is more than a political moment. It's a call to action. It's a reminder that the stories we tell and the stories we choose to hear can change hearts, open minds, and shape the future of our country. So, the next time you hear someone's story, listen. Really listen. Because you never know whose life you might change, or whose story might change yours. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you believe in the power of stories, if you believe in the promise of America, if you believe that every voice matters, make sure to subscribe, share your own story in the comments, and stay tuned, because together we are writing the next chapter.